I can't even tell you how many pictures I have missed because my tele-extender was between my camera and the lens in the wrong time and I had too much focal length. Sometimes I was trying to get it out rapidly and then the action happened during this time. And there is also the issue that if you need to do these changes quickly and in a kind of rough environment, you can get sand, dirt, dust, whatever into your body, and that's something you want to avoid as well. Still, when I shoot with long telephoto lenses, there is not really an alternative to using teleconverters, right? Well, kind of. When Nikon announced the new 600mm f4 with an integrated teleconverter that can be switched on and off with just a movement of your finger, I immediately thought this must be the dream lens for every wildlife and especially bird photographer. At least on paper it just sounds perfect. And I had now the opportunity to test this lens for roughly 10 days. I shot over 10,000 pictures with it, without a teleconverter, with the integrated tele-extender activated, and I even used an external one so that I got a total reach of 1200mm. And in this video I want to share my findings. I want to give you a thorough review about sharpness, autofocus, image stabilization, the handling of the lens and everything. There's also some things I didn't like, so I will also get to these. And in the end I want to answer the question, of course, if this one will find a new home and stay with me, or if I will stick with my Canon glass. So let's skip to the specs and more importantly to the handling of the lens. When I got the lens the first time and I held it, I was like, wow, this is so lightweight. Granted, I come from an EF 600mm f4 of the second generation, which is by now 10 years old and weighs between 3.8 and 3.9 kilograms. And this here comes at 3.26 kilograms, so it's a crazy saving. And also you feel that all the lenses are a bit more towards the body, so it's not so front heavy, so it just handles way better. And of course, current Sony and Canon lenses are also much lighter. In fact, the current Sony and Canon lenses are lighter than this lens. But I think that's not a fair comparison because this one has the 1.4 tele-extender included already. So if we add the weight of the 1.4 tele-extender for Sony and Canon, then we get more or less in the same ballpark. So the Canon is 50 grams heavier than this combination. The Sony is 50 grams less. So I think overall really comparable, and I would be surprised if anyone could tell me the difference from handling them in the field. I mentioned that I really like this lightweight, but what I also appreciate is that the lens is rather short. It's shorter than the alternatives from Sony and Canon. Why is this important? For once, when I travel by plane, I feel like if I have a shorter lens that is just using less space, I can maybe use a smaller backpack and be less likely controlled at the gate for checking the weight of my backpack. And the second thing is, just when I go hiking in my backpack, in my f-stop Shin, the big one, I can barely fit my 600mm Canon with the R5 attached, and this combination is just so much easier to fit in. And then if you also want to throw in a tele-extender or whatsoever, so this is amazingly short. I also like that the lens hood is a bit shorter than the one that Canon provides. The minimum focus distance with this lens is 4.3 meters, and with this you get a maximum magnification of 1:7, which is not great, but to be fair, none of the 600mm f4 were ever doing great in this. So the minimum focal distance of the Canon is like 4.2, the one of the current Sony is 4.5, so this falls quite in between with the 4.3, it's doing very well. If we move to the buttons that we have here on the side, you can see the AF/MF switch, and below there is the focus limiter. So there is the option for the full range or 10 to infinity. I really think it's a missed opportunity that I didn't put like a close setting as well, like 4.3 until 12 meters maybe, that is slightly overlapping with the 10. This would be amazing for me because if I take pictures of songbirds at a feeder, maybe you know it with mirrorless cameras, it's always a bit the risk that once the camera locks on the background, it will not find the bird again on the stick. Even if you try a single point or spot autofocus, it will just have trouble finding it. And these are the situations where I really appreciate it. My Canon is the 4.5 meters to 16 meters range. Again, it could be 4.3 to 12, 4.3 3 to 15, I don't care so much, but something close would be really appreciated here. Of course, Nikon cannot change this part anymore, but what would be cool, I think, if they would just allow to customize this in the camera in the menu, because as you might notice, there is no switch for turning the IS on or off or switching between sport and the normal mode. This is all done in the camera menu of the Z9. So maybe the focus limiter could also be set in the camera. That would just be my wish for a firmware update for the Z9 actually. Otherwise, on this side, you can also see there is a lens FN function button. I was never using this just because it's like too far behind. If I usually handhold the lens, my left arm is, or my left hand is quite more on the front of the lens, so I can just not reach the button, but no big deal, it's not so important for me. If we switch to the right side, the main thing you will see here is of course the switch for the integrated tele-extender, and this is positioned perfectly. Like even if I'm taking pictures with my middle finger, I can just switch it up and down quite easily. You can also lock it if you want. You can lock it in the position 1 or 1.4. I never use this, but maybe it's nice for some people that it's here. Otherwise, just up front there is like the memory set, so like the focus preset, I think it's called with Canon and Sony, where you can just set the focus to a certain distance, and then by using either this ring here in front or another button on the camera that you assign or on the lens, you can like switch back to the focus where you set it, and you can even set multiple distances. So for me this was kind of a workaround because I didn't have the close focus limiter on this lens. So yeah, I already mentioned the buttons and this ring here. Behind there is like a control or function ring. I was trying to put the ISO or the aperture on this one, but to be honest it didn't work so well for me. I feel like it's going too smooth, it's giving me too little feedback, so sometimes I tried to change the ISO and apparently I didn't turn it enough, so it didn't change at all, or I turned it too quickly and it was changing too much. So here I somehow prefer the implementation of Canon, for example on the RF 100 to 500. It has kind of more a haptic feedback, and for me this works much better. However, the real problem lies a bit closer to the camera, and that is the focus ring. You can see it's here. It turns nicely and everything, no complaints about this, but the position is just not good for me. So if I shoot handheld like this, I have my hand here to have it balanced, and now I cannot reach the focus ring anymore, or I really need to twist my hand and try to use it like this. And again, with mirrorless cameras, I actually use the manual focus ring quite a lot, not for precisely focusing, but for just throwing it from, let's say, 30 meters quickly to 7 meters or something. And this is really hard with this lens and has already cost me some shots, to be honest. Finally, you have the tripod collar. It turns really smoothly. It has 4 markings for 0, 90, 180, 270 degrees. I would prefer if there would be a small like haptic or acoustic feedback, like a small click to know when you are at 90 degrees. But I guess that's not so important. And to be honest, I was also never using the camera on a tripod, except when I was doing some test shots for Sharpness, but we will get to this a bit later. And actually, before we continue with Sharpness, Autofocus, IS, and so on, I want to show you some sample pictures that I was able to take with this lens in the last 10 days. if you spend such an enormous amount of money on a lens like this, you obviously expect that it has high-end sharpness, like the best of the best. And I was not really doubting it, but I still wanted to test it, and I quickly compared it to my Canon 600mm, again EF version 2. And you can see it here, it was just in a setup at home. So I tried it at the maximum aperture because I think closing down a lens like this, that's not why I buy an expensive f4 and heavy f4 glass. And you see once this feather a close up from the center of the frame, once from the edge of the frame at 600mm f4, and then using the extender, so the integrated one on the Nikon, on the Canon obviously a normal extender, so we get to 840mm f5.6, and you can see both in center and at the edge of the frame we are reaching quite similar values or levels of sharpness. I have the feeling the Canon has the slight edge, but if you see this in the real world, I'm kind of doubting it. I was trying to have both cameras with me. It was already not easy to take them in the backpack. I was on the train with both the 600mm from Canon and Nikon, and I did some test shootings side by side, and you can see it here with this mallard, both male and female. I do have the feeling that the Canon is a tad sharper, but it's so little that just in Capture One or Lightroom you increase the sharpness slider by a bit and that's it. So I think both are performing well, and I was really happy with the performance of this lens. Additionally, I want to stress that image quality is more than just image sharpness. There are other factors that are at least as important, and that's how is the lens dealing with chromatic aberration. How is the color rendition? Because also this is highly influenced not only by the camera sensor, but also by the glass that sits in the lens. Then if you shoot backlit, do you get lens flares easily that are kind of distracting or not? And if you shoot again backlit and you are, let's say, taking pictures of waterfowl and you have some areas in the water that are blurry, you get these nice big circles. How is the bokeh on this? How do they look like? Are they like nicely round? Do they have weird edges? And here I need to say in all aspects the Nikon was performing very well. I was very pleased with the results. Speaking of these lens flares, in the corner of the frame they get a bit distorted, but that's the same for my 600mm from Canon as well. This is just physics, I guess. Otherwise, really performing splendidly. Let's talk about autofocus. And this is for me something that is a bit hard to judge. I think after 2.5 weeks of intensive photography with the Z9, I know more or less how the autofocus system works. I have a more or less good feeling which kind of autofocus method I use for which scene. But still, I think most of the difference that we can see between this lens and my 600mm from Canon comes down to the autofocus performance of the Z9 and R5 and not necessarily the lens. But I still had just a feeling the lens was focusing very quickly. Once it was locked on the subject, it was like tracking it properly. It was not showing any like pumping or changing of the focus like that would cause blurry images. And I compared it a bit to the 400mm f4.5 from Nikon, and I had the feeling that this one was actually having a better autofocus performance. So again, overall, very pleased. I took over 10,000 pictures with this lens, and apart from the few test shots that you have seen before, none of them was taken from a tripod. So this means that I value the image stabilizer quite a lot. So that's an important subject. How is it on this lens? Well, with one word, fantastic. Again, I'm coming from a 10-year-old Canon lens, so the comparison is not fair, but I'm used to good image stabilizer from the like RF 100 to 500 lens from Canon, and here I feel like it's also on this level. You look through the viewfinder, you touch the shutter button, and you feel immediately how it gets more stable, and when you take the pictures or you take movies, it just stays very stable. The only thing here I noticed, once I was starting to take a burst of pictures, it was like quickly changing the frame a bit. This is a bit like with a quick movement, not really disturbing. I just noticed it, and this was not happening if I had it in the sports mode of the image stabilizer, but I prefer the normal mode because it gives better image stabilization overall. Nikon claims 5 steps of image stabilization with the lens. If it's coupled with the Z9, you get 5.5 because of the IBIS that sits in the Z9. And I find it always hard to test this, but I can just give you some numbers that I did with some tests of mine. So I did a test shot with 1/100th of a second with both this lens and the 600mm from Canon, the EF version 2. And with the Canon EF version 2, I got 89% completely tech sharp images and 11% like still acceptable sharpness. None were completely blurry. With this one, 96% sharp images and 4% still acceptable. So that was quite good. Then I thought maybe I should reduce the shutter speed even more, because even though I don't often go below 100th of a second, sometimes I'm a bit in a weird position, and this like also makes it harder for the IS to work. So I just went to 1/25th of a second. And with this lens, I still got 58% of the pictures tech sharp, 42 were still acceptable sharp for my definition. Whereas with the Canon, you could see that it's a 10-year-old lens, so I only had 24% sharp images, 47 more or less sharp, and 29 really blurry. So this one was clearly the winner, and even the ones that were not tech sharp still seemed a bit sharper than with Canon. Probably you get very similar results if you use a new Sony lens or a new Canon RF lens. I just did not have this at my disposal, and I can just say I'm very pleased with the image stabilizer. It's also basically silent, at least I cannot hear it when it's in use. To summarize so far, we have excellent image quality, good autofocus, excellent image stabilizer, a good weight, but the competition can do this as well. What's really making this lens special for me is the integrated teleconverter, so I want to talk a bit about this. First of all, the position is perfect. Either with my ring finger or with my middle finger, I can easily activate and deactivate it. I didn't need the lock switch here, but maybe for some people it's nice that it's here. The autofocus performance seemed not to be too much affected, if at all, with the tele extender engaged, but this might depend a bit how you shoot. But overall, I was really very pleased with the performance and also the image quality. I had the feeling it took a slight hit, but really not too much. So I'm really happy about having it. And in the Z9, if you look through the viewfinder, you also have a small icon that shows you if the teleconverter is engaged or not. If you want even more reach than the 840mm, you can of course couple it with an external extender, for example a 1.4. So this gives you 600 times 1.4 times 1.4 is roughly 1200mm at f8. And Nikon advised me not to do it. And I know why, because I did this already with my 600mm lens from Canon, putting a 2x extender, and the results were a bit meh. They were usually good on my DSLRs, but with the R5 that has really a high pixel density, a 45 megapixel sensor, you just see all the small mistakes much more. But I'm stubborn, so I still wanted to try it. And I need to say, yes, I saw a bit of drop in image quality, especially if you shoot wide open. If you stop down to like f9 or f10, the image quality improved a lot and the sharpness was really good. With the autofocus performance, I was really surprised how well it was performing. One thing I just want to mention here is like, really think twice about if you want to use 2200mm. Not because the glass is not good. I think this is just for all brands. It's a lot of focal length. So there's so many things that can go wrong. The whole combination is more prone to shutter shake. Maybe the autofocus misses slightly. You can have problems that there is just too much dust or moist or like some heat distortion going on. So I don't use it if I see a bearded vulture that is 1 kilometer away and I think, ooh, that's too small, I better throw in an additional extender. No, there it's just the wrong use case. However, if I have like a swan or a duck that is like 10, 50 meters away from me, and I think, it has so beautiful feather details, I want to take a close-up shot, a portrait or whatever, I think this is more the use when you want to use a tele extender. I've now talked a lot about the lens, so what are my conclusions? This lightweight and great image stabilizer makes it just an awesome combination for doing wildlife shots. The competition might offer something similar, but what it sets it really apart is this easily activatable and deactivatable teleconverter that is integrated. That's for me a game changer. And if I would shoot Nikon, or if this lens would have a Canon RF mount, I think I would buy it. Even though it's quite expensive, it's around $4,000 to $5,000, I think more than the competition from Sony and Canon. But just this little switch makes it worth it for me, because I missed so many shots in the past due to this. Now for me, what am I going to do? Unfortunately, I will just bring it back tomorrow and not buy one because I'm too heavily invested in the Canon system. I just hope that in 1 or 2 or maybe 3 years we see something similar from Canon. If Canon does it, please also look a bit at what Nikon did good, like put the extender here on the right side and you can easily access this when hand holding. and maybe keep some things that I prefer on the Canon system, like the focus ring that feels here a bit like in a weird position. So thanks for watching. I can still keep my Z9 and the 400mm 4.5 for another week. So there will be a review following for that. If you're interested, subscribe to the channel. Thanks for watching. See you next time.